When you just create a system where you don't reward people well or in accordance to how much effort they do, you're just going to create rent-seeking behavior.
Welcome to Brave. Learn from Southeast Asia's best tech leaders. Build the future, learn from our past, and stay human in between. No BS on success. I'm Jeremy Au, venture capitalist, serial founder, Harvard MBA, science fiction nerd, and dad of 2 daughters. Every week, we debate startup news, interview changemakers, answer listener questions, and share personal insights. Join our movement of over 40,000 members and get transcripts, resources, and community at www.bravesea.com. Stay well and stay brave.
Hey Gita, good to have you.
I'm now here
In person.
in your place
I know, we've been doing online
forever.
forever.
Yes,
And I'm excited. I don't know how this is going to turn out.
we're about to find out.
Awesome.
I hope so. Yeah.
It's like, this podcast, but fumbled it.
But
Let's
I'm
go
like,
back to online.
What shall we talk about? I have
Sure.
no idea.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, well, they were just catching up about everything.
Yes.
So Gita, so good to see you in person. So what are you doing in Singapore? How has that trip been?
I know. So this is a business trip,
Yeah.
but it's a business trip where I'm trying to learn more about my new roles. And basically now this is the time to relax and record a podcast with my friend.
Oh, that's so nice. Yeah, well, I'm glad we're doing it. And the topic that we want to talk about was this article. I'm laughing because we shared articles.
Yes.
So everyone's just like listening and just like, why are they giggling about
Why are
this?
they laughing?
Okay, so the story that we have, the article is about Preman, Preman, and it's about gangsters who are holding up the BYD as well as the VinFast electric car plants in Indonesia. So this was in the SCMP, the Chinese English language newspaper. I thought it was an interesting article. Talked about the reason why it came up is that I think local minister in Indonesia spoke about it, saying that, hey, this is a government priority to do it so that we can encourage more investment into Indonesia. So I'm kind of curious, like, what's your take on the whole system?
To Indonesia. So that is called Preman. Preman culture means gangster culture or mafia culture. And basically these are the types of informal network of people or just individuals who cause havoc to businesses. This has been an issue in Indonesia, probably going back to the colonial era when they would need local people to bully other local people into working and creating revenue for the colonial powers. And then as we kept going, it kept developing, throughout the different types of administration. So including during the Suharto era, we had that level of Premanism, except now, I think because the keys of power were divided and became fractured, because back then during the Suharto era, it was centralized, that one person and then the person's cronies. Now you just see them fractured throughout the country, both from a regional level, local level, even all the way up towards the high ranks. That's where we have our current Preman culture, where a typical business, and I'm not talking just BYD and VinFast. Preman culture can affect everyone, starting from mom and pop stores all the way to BYD. So this is not just something that happens to foreign investors, but Preman culture is one of those things that the local communities, but especially the public sector, must fight against.
So let's talk about what the problem is before going to solutions.
Yeah, totally.
I think this is actually the first time I heard about this. Would you expect the local gangsters trying to extort money or get bribes? Most emerging markets kind of have that. It's called protection money. Singapore had a problem 60 years ago. China had a problem 30, 40 years ago.
Yeah.
I mean, even today, I think in Japan, they have the Yakuza, which is the Japanese mafia. Mexico, there's also protection. The concept of local gangsters requiring local taxation, I guess, seems... But I think for the first time, I never understood the scope of this problem.
Yeah, it's quite large, and it has also become quite systemic, unfortunately. And that tends to happen in emerging markets, as you said. Indonesia isn't the only one. It happens in all the other markets. And that tends to happen basically in places where rule of law isn't very firm, especially administering the law, which Indonesia, as we all know, tend to have a lot of challenges with that. So what ends up happening are all these rent-seeking behaviors that come out. Rent-seeking behaviors don't just happen in the public sector, where we all are very familiar with how Indonesian public sector often sees a lot of corruption cases, but it also happens in the informal sectors. Not only are these mafia types come out in individual form, but they can even come out to this type called ormas or organisasi masyarakat, which is translated to the people's organization.
Well, that sounds so
Sounds so nice, doesn't it?
Who wouldn't want to join the people's
Who
organization?
wouldn't realize these people's organization can cause a lot of havoc in factories, mining sites, even small businesses, even a typical retail business in a popular area. They could experience these disturbances. Depending on where you are, what type of business, and how big the businesses are, the treatment from these types of bullies can really vary, and they can vary very widely. There are some that are probably more streamlined, so there's one dude that you pay off and that's it. There are also ones where you don't know who you just paid off and why you have to pay them off, how often you will have to pay them off, and all of these unpredictability makes the cost of doing business in Indonesia get higher. Because again, it's not just about the formal cost of doing business, you also have to think about the informal cost of doing business. That's what makes this problem so damn complicated.
I always remember that, I think 20 years ago, the joke about China was that there was corruption, but it was very efficient in the sense that you only had to pay once, right? And then you effectively got a receipt, and that made it easy for businesses to be like, okay, this is a predictable cost of doing business. But it sounds like it's much more disorganized.
Yeah, it gets, you could say it's bottoms up, but also top down though. Because some of these people's organization can also be backed by a politician or a local political party, which then gets very muddied, right? You don't know who's backing them. Is there anyone backing them? And that is the part where if you're just not familiar with the region or you're not familiar with that sector in Indonesia, then it can just be a very loaded situation. And that's what makes this entire concept and this entire situation very tough to deal with. Because it's not just about, oh, we can come up with a rule of law tomorrow that can easily solve this, you know? The question then becomes, okay, but rent-seeking behavior, when they come out in the informal sector, it's because of so many other systemic reasons. So it's not just about saying tomorrow, no more preman, no more ormas. You also have to consider, okay, then how do you also reroute, you know, these groups of people into other sources of revenue? Like, how do you empower them so they don't see this as the only way out? Yeah.
When you say that, it reminds me a lot of the stories of New York or mafia in America. There was the Italian mafia. There was a big push by the police to break them up. And that wasn't a long time ago. It's like 40 years ago. So
it wasn't super
it was like America, number one, only cleaned it up maybe for the past 40 years. So, I mean, as you say out loud, it makes me process. Obviously, Hong Kong has an issue with triads, right? Which is the version of syndicates. They make some really good Hong Kong movies about it, like Infernal Affairs. You know, a lot of dirty cop movies that they used to make. You know, dirty politicians, a dirty Golden Triangle and all that stuff. So, you know, I think even Hong Kong has only just cleaned that up over the past 30 years even as well.
This brings into question what is at the root of the problem, and the root of the problem is never as simple as, oh, you know, just outlaw them, because people come out with rent-seeking behaviors in emerging markets probably trying to find a different way where they can get money faster and more of it, because usually they come from areas where there's a lot of poverty, and that's just very hard to live with. Think of putting yourself in another person's shoes. How do you feel if GDP per capita is $5,000? The average person makes $5,000 a year. And you think to yourself, well, my parents did that and they made that much. I worked harder in school, yet I still make only that much. All my neighbors make that much. Everyone around me makes that much. You know, how will I move up? Can I ever move up? Will my kids live my same life? The issue gets very layered because a lot of people feel like they don't have hope in moving up the socioeconomic ladder. For many reasons, not just poverty, but also there's questions of what's your education system like? Even if you finish your education system, what's the probability that you can move up the corporate ladder? Or is that person at the top always reserved for the kid of the owner, right? And so these questions of, back then we call it KKN, or corruption, collusion, and nepotism, they're still around until today. There's still questions that are not answered.
I think it reminds me of this Harvard MBA lesson they had. They had a lead question for multinational corporations working in emerging markets.
Yeah.
There was this study which was like, why do these companies do ESG? Why do they donate to the community?
Yeah.
And I think there was two parts to it. I think the first part was they do it when they have a lot of assets that are fixed and immobile, right? So if your assets are digital and it's hard to extract rents from, then you don't need to do much local community donations. But if you have an asset like a oil rig, people can just come in and treat you like a pinata.
Totally.
It's important for those companies to build that formal community support programs that helps build up local community support, build up local politician support, and also keeps the local stakeholders aligned.
Totally.
And it's done positively in the form of education, nutrition programs, medical programs.
Entire ecosystem to people up.
I thought it was interesting. And I guess what's interesting is that one thing you reminded me as well. I thought it was interesting where the Indonesian minister was like, this is a problem, we need to fix it for these two companies, BYD and VinFast. And then BYD and VinFast was like,
we're okay.
We're okay. We didn't complain. We totally complained to him and he said it, but I didn't.
I'm totally fine.
I'm fine with it. So just in case you have a problem with me.
Yes, exactly.
Minister.
Right. We never complain. Actually, I think people also don't realize how there are so many companies and it's not just foreign, it's also local, right? Not only have they all experienced some form of this, but you don't do very well when you complain too much about it in public and cause a stir.
Right.
Because you're already not very famous in that area to begin with.
Right.
You are in a country where there's a huge distribution inequality.
Right.
That's not great, and you're saying you're this large conglomerate trying to open something extractive in that area. So you're already not particularly liked even when you came in. So I think that gets very hard as to how do you even bring up this issue in public. Now, that's a conglomerate. Imagine if you're a mom and pop store that just keeps getting squeezed. What can you say? Especially with people in general in Indonesia just tend to not trust law enforcement, right? And we have a very famous saying that no viral, no justice.
What does that mean, sir?
So this saying is because sometimes the police won't move unless we cause it to go viral on the internet. We would bring up a case and the netizens in millions would just drive up the traffic for an issue and then finally they would get to it. There's that very famous saying of, oh, no viral, no justice. And it's just if we always have to, right? I think this is what makes also disclosing the issue and thinking about the issue really tough.
Yeah. I think there's a super fair point, right? Which is that ministers spoke it in the context of BYD and VinFast, which are electric vehicle manufacturer. And obviously they represent China and Vietnam respectively as well. But it didn't come out in the context of like your local mom and pop store. So when even I read the article, I read it as, oh, this is only affecting the large manufacturers, but you're telling me it's systematic.
It's quite systematic and it can happen in a lot of different areas. So it can happen, industries, other factories. Sometimes it can also blow up in people's faces when they do it because let's say it is a foreign-owned company. That foreign-owned company can easily also just walk away. Right?
Yeah.
And that has happened in the past where Indonesians tried to squeeze them so hard that they ended up just walking out because the rent-seeking behavior made it impossible for them to create sustainable, predictable returns over time.
I got to ask this question, and maybe you can give me a range here, which is what would be the range of rent extraction? Is it like 1% of
It depends. It depends on
how
business.
how do they define it?
Also depends on the people's organization. Who are they, right? But also how big are they? Are they backed by a political party? So for example, are you going into an area that is dominated by a certain political party or even belief system or even the people, right? A certain, situation that you're going into where it's just dominated by one thing that you don't know about.
Yeah.
And that would become a problem.
It's just kind of curious because there's always that economist side of me, which is governments should compete with these gangs because governments and local governments have the ability to tax and then they provide security. To some extent, there shouldn't be two centers of power, in the same place because, you're draining money from each other.
Totally. But again, this is what makes things hard. There are a lot of public servants in Indonesia that have never worked a day in the private sector. I don't really think it's a fair point to say, oh, all people in public sector are corrupt. Actually, most aren't. Most are just normal public sector servants. Really, they're just been there since they graduated college and continue to be there until retirement. What's really tough about that situation is you can have master degrees, get scholarships to Oxford, and be so faithful in the public sector system and make less than 1,000 a month. And then maybe at your peak, you're just making $2,000 a month if you're very lucky. And that makes life super hard for the average public servant. Most public servants really find it fulfilling to do great things. But what I'm saying is when you just create a system where you don't reward people well or in accordance to how much effort they do, you're just going to create rent-seeking behavior. Especially that gets hard in the regional and local levels where the payment is even lower. You can be the head of a village and make $400 a month. That's nuts. Then how are you going to pay for anything, right? Again, that creates rent-seeking behavior. So when the money comes from the federal government or when you attract certain types of investment and they send the money to you, I can totally see how a person who thinks, that's so crazy. I'm working really hard to watch over, let's say, 10,000 residents. Why am I getting paid only a couple of $100s a month?
Right.
So I think this situation is not the kind of black and white thing where you can easily say, oh, that's because all politicians are corrupt or all politicians are evil. But it's more like the reality in emerging market is these systems are simply not well put yet. Often it's also just a younger country, a younger system, or they simply are not in a development stage yet to do it.
What's interesting is that some countries have noticed that behavior from their state or city level or town level. Some countries have solved it by decentralizing tax. To them, what's the balance of power between, because I don't know, federal versus like, I don't. I guess for me as an outsider, actually, I don't really understand how taxes work, because in China it's well known that, at least I understand, that federal central government is very strong. The provinces don't have much ability to tax.
Yeah.
So that's the Chinese style, but I'm just curious from the Indonesia side.
Okay, not super safe, but Indonesia has a very low, I think it's even in the single digits, of citizens paying taxes for two reasons. One, most citizens don't make enough to be taxed. Their income is too low. But second, getting people to pay taxes is very hard. You have to see how you administer these laws. We've always had a problem with not about public policy creation. Well, there's a problem there too, but more about administering the policy. So we find it very hard to track people and make them pay taxes. We find it really hard to even get the right data. Oh my gosh, get the right software to get people to pay taxes more easily online. We recently had a big kerfuffle where the government tried to launch this supposedly better tax solution. It's called core tax, which ended up becoming such a pain in the bum for lots of corporations that they lost tax revenue for that quarter because so many people couldn't use it. So again, that is some of the challenges that happens when we think about taxing people or when we think about how do you centralize something or how do you make the method of doing this easier for people. We have so many issues in that.
I never knew that. I think that's interesting, right? Because doesn't that just be an obvious source of revenue? Just
Yes,
like
100%.
people who can't pay, we just say they don't need to pay because they're too poor and should just pay. And then that gives us more revenue for the government. And
We'd
then
like
the
to
government
think
can
so.
enforce the rules and law, and then that solves the Preman problem,
We'd like to think. So I tend to say this to a lot of people who see an inefficiency in not just Indonesia, but any emerging market. If they see an inefficiency and they go, hey, I'm going to easily solve that because that's a question of better streamlining or better user interface design, I'll always ask, then always question who's benefiting from this inefficiency because someone is, right? And so before you go in there and try to muck everything up, always question who's really profiting from this big headache and this big issue that's happening. One of the things that I find about Indonesia, rather than go head on, it's actually better to find ways to work with the local system the way it is. But maybe you'd like to empower people differently. So, for example, this is also one of those industries in the world of waste management. How do you empower the local mafias there work together with your waste management solution? Companies are experimenting to find ways to empower these people by giving them an official title, giving them a work contract for the first time in their lives. They're in the formal sector and get paid a little bit more. People are already scared of them anyway. They can be security. There are ways of dealing with the system rather than just going head to head, which is not necessarily the most productive way.
Yeah, I think it makes a lot of sense. And it's been interesting to see that story happen time and time again. It's like these people want to take care of their families and the community. How do you do it, right? So I think giving them that formal way of work and applying that makes a lot of sense. I think what's interesting is that when you look at this article as well, I think it was also talking about the fact that, there's not really a national people's organization, which is quite interesting because different countries, at some level, the gangs have turf wars. They sort themselves out, and then they slowly become systemized.
They start
rolling out
M&A,
acquiring turf. And then it becomes more formalized, right? Like Yakuza or triads. But it sounds like this situation is very much more fragmented. Every island has different groups. There's a lot of fragmentation.
You can say that.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's more fragmented. There are some that are just bigger. There are organizations, often they're backed by a politician or they're backed by a party or maybe they're backed by some kind of other organization. They can get bigger. They can get to the level where they can be seen as an actual people's organization you should work with. And there are some that have turf wars. But again, there's no real formula. It depends on your locality sector and what you're doing.
So the solution would be
This is amazing.
They should just roll up all of it into a formal organization, the ultimate platform. And then that's it, There you go.
That's hilarious. What are you doing? I'm creating the first platform for Preman. And it's like, what?
It's just, you gotta roll up all of it.
B2B SaaS solution.
Sorry, Preman as a service.
Preman as a service.
But, I think what's interesting is, let's talk about solutions. I think you gave a few of them, right? You said that some people just leave, is exit the zone.
Yeah.
Others just collaborate and do the payments, whatever they can make sense.
Right. Complain to minister.
It gets reported out by the Chinese, English newspaper. So the Chinese Communist Party is like, oh, hey, I see the bad signal. Time to come in and protect my multinational corporations. I'm just kind of curious from a local perspective. How do you think about it? Is it like fix the system?
Oh my gosh, we've all been very familiar with the situation. I think probably since we were born. And it's always this question of, well, you could find a way to reduce these incidences locality by locality. But really what people have been looking for is more certain rule of law on administering the law. It's that simple and yet it's not. It's basically this question where we always ask, wait, is that law made for only that person? Which we've done. Let's be super real. We've done things where it's not administered equally. Right? So usually the lower down of the socioeconomic ladder you are, you'll experience the law much more than people up top. And that's not what makes a country have a strong rule of law. The whole concept is everybody has the same right to due process. So I think this is a huge homework to really consider strong, not just legal reforms, but also strong administration of the law. Like, how do you administer it in a way that is equitable? So it's not as simple as, oh, let's just roll out the military and police everywhere. But it's more about, no, how do you make it so that it makes people want to work and contribute and invest? And we're not talking about just, oh, well, how do you get the BYDs to invest? But also, how do you make it so that your mom and pop store is safe? And mom and pop stores feel like they can really thrive and in that locality. Do you make it easy for people to open bank accounts? Do you make it easy for people to open an LLC? How easy is it for them to get traditional bank financing, for example, which is closed for so many sections of society? It's about that. It's just letting capital flow, which we're often not doing because we're so scared of not having it to begin with, that with the scarcity mindset, we end up with rent-seeking behaviors. Rather than enlarge the pie, I better make sure I eat the pie while it's there.
Yeah. That makes sense. If I was a mom and pop store,
Yeah.
and if I look too rich or successful, someone's going to come after me and ask for
Yeah.
more
Oh, God.
protection money.
Yeah.
Then you're just going to be like, well, I'm just going
why?
to, that's not going to become too successful, and I'm not going to put my head.
I'm going to put my head down.
Keep my head down and survive. Speaking about rule of law, what was interesting is that we recently had eFishery. The founder came out and confessed this fraud. He felt like he was doing it for a greater cause. And then he talked about the numbers and he explained how he made the decision several times to commit that fraud. He shared that there was a point when he could have stopped the fraud and caught up with his
Lies. They were lies. Yeah.
his accounting numbers versus his real numbers. And he said SoftBank came and I had, he had felt like he felt obliged to keep going. Anyway, I'm just saying it from his perspective.
I know. We all read that article.
We all read the article.
Yeah.
It was mind-blowing because at the start of this process, all of us were like, is this true? Is this the VCs who pushed him too hard? Now he's just come out and just said he did it.
Yeah.
And he did it early.
Yeah.
I don't know how you feel about what he wrote.
Again, this is the part where I say, really question why there's so much rent-seeking behavior. But with what he did, I mean, they were very much a way to mislead people. And it was very conscious.
Yeah.
And this whole, I did it for the greater good, before we start demonizing different groups of people for trying to make money fast, a lot of people actually think like that, right? When they're squeezing other people, when you're bullying other people, oh no, I'm only doing it for my family's well-being, for my sick child, for my wife. There are many ways to justify that you're simply doing the wrong thing. But again, the question is always, how do you create systems in place in an environment where people are just less likely to go into rent-seeking behavior?
Right.
Right? They can't be working super hard and go, oh shoot, I'm still only going to make $5,000 a year. No matter what I do, no matter how hard I work, no matter what sector, I can't go all the way up the ranks because it's always going to be the owner's kid up top. Again, I'm totally not okay with what he did. I really think he should somehow pay for it one day. Not sure why it hasn't really escalated towards anything legal. But again, the problem is, what kind of environment are we creating? When he was saying, oh, other founders do it too.
Yeah.
Because one, ooh, which founders? But also, I know a lot of founders. Yeah, like there are some who probably did it, but the majority of founders are not like that at all. And they'll never get a better chance to defend themselves in front of investors because now he's ruined it for pretty much everybody else. Like normal founders who are just trying to work hard and do the right thing. And then you'll meet them and the first thing out of some random VC's mouth would be, oh, I hear you Indonesian founders do this. And that's really not fair.
Yeah, he basically said that it's a common behavior across Indonesian founders. So I was just like, well, that's pretty mean. And because, the kind of statement, I just think
it's actually pretty wrong.
Yeah.
So the majority of Indonesian founders find it very hard to raise funding in general, in almost any year. They're the ones building solutions and they had to switch to become profitable very early on. I know tons of these founders. Until today, they run profitable businesses. The growth isn't stratospheric, but they're trying to make something work and they give a living to their 10 to 50 employees. Now what? They can't stand up high because someone sold them out and basically claim that they're just like this person who committed lies. That's really not fair.
Yeah, I think it's just not great. And like you said, I think it's definitely real, a stigma associated to Indonesian founders.
Right now?
Right now. Just really not great. I think, what was interesting about that, and you said something like that, you feel like it hasn't been escalated yet.
Yeah.
So I guess the question is the Singaporean police or the Indonesian police going to do anything about this?
I think another thing that makes it not great for the Indonesian ecosystem is that this isn't the first case, right? We've also just had it beforehand, is that you see these founders still moving around. They're still walking out and about, and there's no real legal repercussions so far, right?
And I think that's really the crux of it, right? America also has founders who committed fraud,
100%.
and they went to jail. Elizabeth Holmes
Oh
went to
my
jail
gosh.
for
They have documentaries.
they monetized that.
That, right?
At least they go to jail.
At least they went to jail.
And I think the tricky part is, it was really interesting because at the end of this story of the eFishery confession, he's chilling on a farm with his brother, setting up a new business. I think I was talking to a lawyer called Rachel Wong, and we were discussing more from a legal perspective. And she asked me this question, which was like, I hope it's not pessimism about the Southeast Asian ecosystem. I hope it's cyclical. And I think what I realized was like, whether this is structural or cyclical depends on what happens in these instances. Because if there's no enforcement action, I'm not saying that he's guilty, I'm just saying that he confessed to doing it, but there should be an investigation to figure out the
A
mechanism,
discovery.
figure out what the appropriate level of action is going to be. But at least that has to start. The fact that there's nothing starting. And I was just say like, well, on the Singapore side, what's the point of being the Delaware of Southeast Asia if you can't do enforcement action?
Actually, that's a great question.
Defrauding all investors investing in Singapore,
That's
right?
a great point.
So I feel like Singaporeans should be doing it because if a founder that was doing it in Singapore, they definitely have problems. They reported. So I think there's one part. Of course, the other part is if Singaporeans don't do it, would the Indonesians do it?
It's us.
You should also do it. It means your jurisdiction.
Like,
it's your farmers.
Agree.
Your employees.
Agree.
I
think that's what I've been saying a lot about why doing business in Indonesia gets very hard. All of our macros are super interesting. Our demographic is young, it's very big, and it's very promising. I agree to all of that. But the flip side of that is realizing that we just don't have strong rule of law, especially the enforcement side. We shouldn't have a situation where it's no viral, no justice. We shouldn't have a situation where rule for the few, rule for none. We can't have that concept. It seems that concept tends to happen again and again. Even if you look at some of our biggest corruption cases, the end point is rarely terrible. Someone could defraud the state by billions of dollars and then they end up in jail for 2 years. Or sometimes 6 months. And
it's pretty good ROI. I mean,
oh gosh. For the person, not for all of us.
It's like 2 years of jail for
billions.
$1 billion per year.
But that's why you have people being very pessimistic with how justice works. And I think, like what you said, you can't be the Delaware of Asia and not proof that you're a place that's safe to invest. But Indonesia is the same. If you're going to really leverage this supposed bonus demographic of people who are young and work ready and ready to be educated, and there's so many of us, you then also need a place to make us feel safer to do business, invest, and actually just live in the local area.
I'm just kind of wondering, it's like, is the Singapore police force waiting for the Indonesia police? And is the Indonesian police waiting for the Singapore police?
I hope not.
I mean, I'm just wondering if they're like, just kind of like waiting for the other person to...
You'll be waiting for Indonesian police force for a long time.
What they should do is hold hands and then go to the dance floor together and start the party going.
It's been wild. And I think it's something that lots of people are asking for, right?
Right.
It's for all, not just for a select group.
I think what's interesting is that we're talking about this issue. Like, what's the way forward? Is it my proposal? Police, the Indonesian police, take action on this, figure out the investigation.
Yep.
And then, that provides a certain set of guidelines to the whole side, which is please don't do accounting fraud, otherwise you'll be investigated as a norm for founders. I think that builds investor confidence across the region. It also helps good in Southeast Asia say, okay, we can build and from this process. And that'll be, I don't know, one small step for this.
Absolutely. Trust me, I'm a very big fan of very large cases like these, especially cases that went this viral, to have some kind of legal repercussion. Even a discovery would be something. Anything, right? So I think to have some kind of formal legal proceedings happening as a next course of action would be great, because I hope the global instability happening right now would at least push Indonesian lawmakers and also just Indonesian public sector to start taking this issue of legal reform and administering the law equitably in a more serious manner. Because with economic crisis, this is my second one as a bill-paying adult, because the first one I was still a teenager. Third economic crisis, I guess, in a way. Sometimes economic crisis can make for the best. Sometimes. I really hope now that there's so much economic instability that hopefully this downward cycle will compel lawmakers and the public sector to make Indonesia a better place to live, work, and do business in.
And I think maybe there's also an interesting piece because you're talking about the macro globally.
Yeah.
And obviously there's been a tariff situation that has happened.
Yeah, right.
And I thought it was an interesting piece. So for Singapore, it's a 10% tariff, even though America was more to Singapore than Singapore sells to America.
Yeah.
And we had a free trade agreement. So technically it was supposed to be zero, but
here we are.
they said zero and now up to 10%. What's the situation with the, kind of like current US administration and the Indonesia tariff?
So it runs gamut, I think. And also we recently sent people to negotiate there. I think you're now looking at anywhere in the 10%, but depending also on the sector. I think we got also hit with some crazy tariff regarding, I think, solar panel or renewable
they
energy.
just came out last week.
It's like in the thousands percent. But I think what is obvious in all of these things is that either way, we're going to be put in a very tight spot. So if you're in a tight spot, what are you going to do to make your country a better place to live, work, and do business in?
Right.
I mean, that's it, because we're pretty challenged in all fronts, whether it's like 20% or whether it's, whatever 1,000% it is for renewable energy and solar. But again, when you're experiencing a squeeze, you could either make the flow of capital easier so that people can better run their businesses. And I'm not talking the BYDs of the world. I'm also talking all the mom and pop stores, all the small, medium businesses. So they realize they can still move up in this world. Let's hope that this squeeze can push our public sector to do better.
I think it's a good point because Indonesia has made a promise of going for 8% economic growth between the average 5% growth that has been so far. The delta of that 3% also be based on unlocking exports. And then a big part of it going to America, for example. So I think that was one of the economic assumptions of that acceleration. Do you think there's going to be one of it? Do you think there's a reset?
We have to be flexible without feeling the need to make any enemies. We've always been very good at staying neutral and being friends with a lot of people. We should probably keep doing that. But make it a much easier place to invest in. We're notorious with sometimes making things much harder than it's supposed to be. And we even have a saying, if you can make it easy, why? Just make it hard. Yeah, that's a real saying that we say.
No, is it real?
Yeah.
Are you saying the explanation of that statement is if you make it harder for somebody else, you can make money from that? Wow.
It's very rent-seeking. So it's like, why make it easier? Unfortunately, that's a thing that a lot of local people say. The only reason I'm saying this is because, look, there are a lot of things that are great, obviously, about Indonesia, right? But we often make lives harder for ourselves. And especially the government, decades, have made a lot of things that simply don't help the typical Indonesian person, so the typical Indonesian business. I hope this becomes a wake-up call. Let's see what happens next. Let's see how we decide to do this current downward cycle.
Thank you so much. I thought it was a really wonderful conversation.
As we talk about gangsters. One fun fact, there's a study called the Flourishing Study, and it's actually about social cohesion around the world, like what country counts as being the most socially cohesive. And Indonesia, I heard, is like number 1 or number 2 in the world.
Wow.
And what's super interesting about that is, because people are like, Gita, you make it sound like it's such a hard place. It is a hard place to do business. I'm not going to lie. Is it better now than before? Absolutely. But one of the things that I think keeps me going there is when it comes to social cohesion and actual sense of community, that's probably one of our biggest strengths. So a lot of local communities have actually fought against gangsters. That is a real thing. So the mom and pop stores of Indonesia, all the way to religious organizations, have fought against that culture. And I think sometimes when they find a way to incorporate this informal sector into the community, that's when you start seeing things better. We're also a flourishing society, despite having so many troubles.
Well, on that note, let's wrap things up.
Thanks so much.
Thank you for listening to Brave. If you enjoyed this episode, please share the podcast with your friends and colleagues. We would also appreciate you leaving a rating or review. Head over to www.bravesea.com for member content, resources, and community. Stay well and stay brave.